So instead of going a little bit code heavy in programming today, I wanted to get into something that I actually do on a day-to-day basis as a data analyst. So my name is Erin. I work as a data analyst, BI professional for AppMex, a company in town here. One of the things that we do and we get asked for fairly frequently is to perform hypothesis testing in several different situations. Some of those situations are A/B testing, control group testing. I don't personally get into cohort testing very much, but it's also very important. A/B testing we do pretty frequently. I put a pretty silly example here. Leadership wants to know whether bubblegum sells better in the checkout or in aisle 7. You can see pretty easily where A/B testing gets its name. Does this perform better than that? AppMex is a digital retailer, and we do a lot of A/B testing on pretty much anything you can think of. You can imagine on your website you want to know what prices are better, certain products, what color schemes are better, what banners are better, that type of thing. Control group testing is another one that you see a lot in any type of marketing situation. Market managers want to know if a certain initiative performs better than how we regularly market to our customers, that type of thing. The example that I came up with was a medical development group wants to know if their new treatment shortens the length of the common cold, which of course is just pie in the sky dreamy, but that's all right. Cohort studies, more often than not seen in government work and medical studies. For instance, the one I have up there, government researchers want to determine the effect of poverty on longevity. Usually cohort studies are to determine whether something is affecting another variable that wouldn't seem necessarily correlated, such as poverty and lifetime length. So these are not necessarily things that we traditionally think of in programming terms, and that's why we turn them off to the data nerds to figure out. But we like to think of programming coming in on the front end, on the back end, because you need to collect the data and understand how you can access it in order to solve these problems, and you also need to use some kind of statistical tool on the back end to actually solve the problems once you've set up the experiment. So the data collection process is programmatically heavy. You have to make sure that all of the data is there before you can promise that you're actually going to solve these problems. So all of those different types of tests require that the data is collected a little bit differently. A/B tests, you're probably going to have to set up your own goals and make sure that you are responsible for getting all of that data in, that the executives or whoever's requesting it of you is interested in discovering. So sometimes it's going to be a little bit of a discovery process of what your goals actually are. Control group testing, you're going to want to make sure that you're collecting the same information for your sample group as for the population as a whole. So say we go back to that common cold example. Could be possible that you have all of the information for the population in general already in your database, but you have to make sure that your collection processes for your sample set are in place exactly the same way as they are for the population as a whole. Cohort studies are a little bit different than the other two because generally speaking, you're going to be coming at those after the fact or a posteriori in Latin. Because you are following these groups for a long period of time, and generally speaking, you're coming at that data after it's already been collected, you're kind of at the mercy of what's already there. So in the example that I came up with of the government trying to determine the effect of poverty on longevity, if they're coming at this study of a long-term cohort analysis, they'll be looking at data for people whose lifetimes they have available to study. The evaluation process, after you've already collected all of that data and made sure that you have enough available or you're collecting it properly for the specific type of test you're interested in studying, are a variety of statistical testing methods. And that's going to depend on the type of test that you're after. So this might look a little bit daunting, but it's a great guide, probably the most comprehensive guide I've seen, about which statistical test you are going to use after you're done collecting your data. The great thing about this is that you don't have to remember all of this, because in reality, most of the programs that we use, whether you're a JavaScript developer or you like R, or you even just work in Excel, they all have built-in functions for this. So the best part is that you don't really have to remember what these are all for once you determine which type of test you need. The biggest process is actually setting up the test. You have to know what you're looking for and state which way it can go. And in hypothesis testing, that's called stating the null and the alternative hypothesis. So H sub 0, or H null, is the traditional way to state the null hypothesis. So that's the standard or the expected outcome for what you're looking for in the test prior to conducting the experiment. The alternate hypothesis is what you're testing for. You have to determine the goals, too, of what your test is trying to accomplish. Of course, you also have to look back at the chart and determine at the end of it all which statistical test or tests you're going to use at the end of it. So pulling it all together, looking back at, say, the bubblegum test for A/B testing, you'd be stating a hypothesis of the null hypothesis that there would be no statistical variation, that any difference between the two placements would be due to random variation, or no difference. You'd have two alternate hypotheses, one being that aisle 7 would be better, one being your checkout would be better. And you'd have to set up your goals, things that you want to track with data. Things like the number of packets that you sold, the quantity of your packets sold. You know, if you sell more of 100 pieces in aisle 7 and more of 20 pieces in the checkout, which one's actually selling you more bubble gum? How much money did you actually make? How many customers were buying that bubble gum? If you sold 100 packets of bubble gum to one customer in one day, does that really count? Probably not. So you have to set these things up, be able to track them so that you can actually get that answer that you're driving after. The statistical test you'd use in this case is a z-test. And I put my rationale there. It's because you're looking at the proportional difference between two samples. And if we go back here, you can track that under which test, two samples, proportion. You get a z-test. I also drew one up for control group testing of the common cold. So your null hypothesis would be what we would expect prior to the experiment, that the new treatment would produce no difference in the length. The alternate treatment is that the new treatment will reduce the length. Depends on how you want to set up your experiment. You could say that the new treatment will vary the length of the common cold. Hopefully it wouldn't increase the length of the common cold, but it's always a possibility. So you would want to track a few things. You know, the number of days that each cold lasts, any side effects, the severity of those side effects, but in this case there are also going to be confounding factors that you would need to look at. If the number of days that each cold lasts are reduced in men instead of women, or a certain ethnicity, does that really count? So you're going to have to set up methods of tracking those confounding factors in your test as well. The statistical test that we're looking at there, I'd say it'd be a t-test because you're looking in the difference of a mean between a sample and a population, but in this case you don't know the standard deviation of the entire population. You're looking at a sample standard deviation because we can't look at the entire population of the world and get the standard deviation there. Cohort study, kind of the same thing. At the end of it, we're looking at a t-test because we're always going to be working with a sample standard deviation because we don't know the entire population. But we're looking at a null hypothesis that economic status has no effect on an individual's longevity. It's a little bit confusing when you start setting up hypothesis testing because you're always stating the null hypothesis as the thing that you're trying to disprove. But once you kind of get used to it, it's pretty simple going that your null hypothesis is always the standard outcome. Your alternate is what you're trying to test, which in this case is living below the poverty line negatively impacts longevity. So goals would be the length of life, maybe the amount of time that this person spent living under the poverty line, if they had family members living under the poverty line, or if it was just them, these types of things that we'd also want to look at. So I said that we used some sort of programmability on the beginning and the end when we were collecting data, as well as analyzing data. And we do. The good part is that it can be really anything of your choosing or of your stakeholders' choosing, as the case may be. If you're, lucky enough to be in an environment where you can just do whatever suits you, you can pick a language of your choice or a tool of your choice. All of these languages, Python, R, have packages built in where you can do statistical analysis without batting an eyelash. Excel has robust statistical tools, although a lot of people kind of laugh at it, but Excel is a great tool as well. Yeah. Tableau also has great statistical tools if your stakeholders use Tableau and just want a nice dashboard presented to them. If you're crazy, you can also do it by hand. So, you can do whatever you want to present this data as you need to. But there it is. That's what data scientists and data analysts do for a large part of their day, is answer questions about what if and why and which one's better. And statistical tools are how we get there. Thanks. So the question is hypothesis testing often used to confirm fairly obvious conclusions, right? Yes. Yeah, and sometimes it is. But sometimes it's also used to produce those fairly obvious conclusions, or what we think of as fairly obvious conclusions now. I wrote that one down because those are two variables that at one point were not thought to be correlated at all. And one also, I guess, fairly obvious conclusion that we think of now is that smoking is correlated with lung cancer. That was a cohort study that was proven out using hypothesis testing that today we say, well, that's obvious, but it wasn't at one point, So a lot of those more major correlative studies were proven out using hypothesis testing, And that's one of the biggest benefits of them, is that using data, you can ignore the highest paid person in the room and just say, we have the facts. This is what it is. So it's one way of either proving or disproving opinion, because sometimes the facts get lost in the truth.